I grew up in St. Petersburg, okay, and I remember going as a child. I grew there not my whole life, but until the age of 13, I was growing up in St. Petersburg. I remember as a child going to the so-called Kolkhoz markets in St. Petersburg, okay, and you could buy in the Kolkhoz markets, even in the middle of the winter, you could buy some good stuff. You could buy, you know, pomegranates, and you can buy nuts, and you can buy some other veggies and greens. And the point I want to make is that these markets, these Kolkhoz markets, were controlled by people that we identified as Georgians. And this, I come from St. Petersburg. And the situation was somewhat like that. I didn't do, as a 13-year-old, I didn't do thorough research into who controls which market where. But I can assure you that there were lots of Georgians in these Kolkhoz markets everywhere. And as I found out later, in fact, these were not just Georgians, these were Jewish Georgians. So many of the guys in St. Petersburg were the Georgian Jews who were in this. They are the traders. They are the people who go in between and look for the arbitrage opportunities. So these people, they performed this function in the Soviet Union time. They moved goods, the Georgian citrus, the Georgian everything. They loaded them on trucks, and they made sure that these trucks actually arrived to a point of destination, bribing everybody along the way, and be sold privately in this Kolkhoz market, bringing back, I was told, something like 20,000 rubles per truck of some goods. And so every Georgian farmer was able to have a new Volga. I mean, and by farmer, I mean somebody who has a garden, like a hectare-sized garden with peaches or apples. So every year, a Georgian guy who would grow his own stuff would be able to get a Volga. You know, in Soviet time, a Volga was unimaginable. I mean, in St. Petersburg, you could probably count. Only the party guys could drive the Volgas, but in Georgia, it was fairly standard. This was the commodity. So these networks that probably the Georgians and the Georgian Jews were very good at, they were one of the factors for the spectacular performance of Georgian agriculture prior to the collapse. And then you have to ask, now this brings me to what happened later. So what happened later were two things. One, of course, was that, well, there was much more than two things, but many things happened. But you had the collapse of the Soviet Union, and which for Georgia, as an exporting country, exporting into the former Soviet Union, into Russia, into St. Petersburg, into Moscow, for Georgia, for all those guys that we described driving Volgas, it meant a loss of their market. The second thing that happened, I don't know if this factor has ever been considered, but the Jews of Georgia have left.
Yeah.
They have left. They're all in Israel, trading some other stuff. No longer veggies. It's now some other. They're all traders. They continue to trade in Israel. Gold and carpets and I don't know what.
Diamond.
All this, yeah. So these traders, the guys who make sure that networks function, they disappeared as well, and the market itself vanished. And so Georgians were left with all their apples and citrus and everything rotting, nowhere to sell. And then you add to that the war, you add to that the crisis of governance, and you get the disaster that you get. So maybe a little bit of this history is important in understanding the crisis. One used the word Kolkhoz in his presentation, but anybody who speaks Russian and anybody who remembers the Soviet time would also know that there were actually two types of collective farms. And one type was indeed called Kolkhoz, but there was another type called Sovkhoz. Few of us would understand what is the difference. For us, they were all the same. But when we analyze this transition, it's actually important to know whether these guys are Kolkhoz, Sovkhoz, or a mix. And let me explain why. And this is again a little bit of history. So if you go back to the roots of the Soviet collectivization, the way it proceeded in everywhere, in Georgia included, was as follows. The Bolsheviks or the Mensheviks initially, it wasn't the Bolsheviks right away, they come to an area And the question they ask, not immediately, after a while, is what do we do with this area? And now what they look at is one simple thing, and that is the land ownership pattern. They look at how the land is divided, subdivided, and how it is, who owns it, how many people own this land, and who is the boss. Okay. Now, in some situations, in some parts of this former Russian Empire, they find the following situation, where all the land, like in Russia is a classical example, pretty much all the land, with few exceptions, is owned by the nobles and the monasteries. So you have a situation when you have very large, like in East Germany, the Prussia, you have the Junker estates. So you have the same situation in many parts of the former Soviet Union when you have no land reform happened. Land was not privatized to peasants, and so all the land is concentrated in the hands of very few owners. Basically, the nobility, and the second largest owner is the church. Yeah. There's a third category of land owned by the Tsar. That's the easiest. That's state-owned land, Tsar ownership. That's the easiest. So you can imagine that for the Bolsheviks or anybody who tries to first of all win the support of the peasants, because it's a political issue, the first thing to do is to take this land, which is essentially nobody's land, now that the nobility has fled the country and the church has been stripped of its power and the Tsar has been finished, kaput. So it's the easiest thing to do. You take this land and you give it to the peasants. Okay? Now, this is Sovkhoz. This is very important. This is a very important fact. So if you look at Georgia, where do you find the Sovkhoz? Where do you find the Sovkhoz type agriculture? You find it in places where land has not been distributed and where the church and the nobility owned most of it. Kakheti is one example. You take a Google view of Kakheti. What do you find? You find flat land, a road, villages, concentrated villages on both sides of the road, and all the land is actually one large massif of land, which is very easy to aggregate because it has never been actually subdivided in any significant way. So it's very easy to privatize it to industrial agriculture, agribusinesses, because it's consolidated. Even though it may be somehow, in terms of ownership, it can be subdivided, but it's still, there are no houses there. They're just big fields, which at one time in history were owned by somebody. At some other time in history, maybe notionally owned by different guys, but it's still one large mass of land which can be easily privatized. Sovkhoz. So what happens when you do, so now let's go to Kakheti. Imagine we are there, and we are 1991. We give this land to the peasants in exactly the same way as it was done throughout. So every peasant gets a little piece of land somewhere in the fields. Now his house, as you remember, is in the village, okay? Is in the village somewhere, and his piece of land can be 5 or maybe 15 kilometers away. It's not fenced in any way. There's no infrastructure. There's not even like a little, I don't know what you call it, a place to put your implements, tools, keep your tractor. So what do you do with this land? It's your land, but what do you do with it? How can you actually do something useful with this land? The answer is you can't. I mean, you can't do much. You can try, but because you're so far from it, and you don't have any resources to fence it, to employ a security service, even if you grow something there, somebody will come and take your harvest. As simple as that. So in this situation, to hope that something good can come out of privatization of this former Sovkhoz is a non-starter. Minded also that people in these areas, and this is something that struck me when I visited one of these places, people in these areas have traditionally never been farmers. Farmers in the sense of managing their own business. They were always working for somebody. It could have been the Tsinandali owners of Tsinandali estate. It could have been the church. It could have been the state. But they never worked for themselves, so they don't understand what it means to be an entrepreneur, to take risk, to invest, to learn skills, to work with people. They follow orders. So this is the type of guys that we have there. And this is the kind of disaster that we later observed in the 1990s. Now, in Georgia, this is not the whole story. In Georgia, you find other areas with other types of agriculture, other types of land ownership, and a completely different skill set. And for me, the best favorite example is San Agrelo, of course. When I go to San Agrelo, when I first came there, I was like shocked. I thought that this is a different country, even though it's called Georgia, but it's a completely different pattern of everything. You travel along the road, you see sidewalks in the villages. You see the streets are wide, and houses are not clustered like they are in Kachetin villages. Actually, houses are much bigger, and they're much fancier, but also they have larger plots of land surrounding the houses. So the San Agrelo guys are the guys who are growing the fruit and the nuts, and they were the guys who were able to load these trucks to go to Russia. They were the guys who were benefiting the most from the Soviet trade networks. And so these guys, they have the skills. They're smart peasants, smart farmers, in fact. When I later had some interactions with them, I was amazed. I mean, this guy would go on the internet. They look for the technology. There's actually online.
But not everybody, come on now.
Not everybody. I'm not trying to say that everybody, but there are some leaders in this community they have the computer, have the skills. I've seen that. I've taken pictures because I was like shocked. Is this the classical Georgian peasant? No, it's not. It's something much. It's a human material that you can work with. And these guys, they have their houses in the middle of their land, so they can actually. The house is in the middle, so it's fenced. There are some trees. They have all the tools that they need. They have. They're able even to help each other when needed. So in this situation, and when they were collectivized, they were not Sovkhoz type. They were the Kolkhoz type. Sorry, I forgot that I'm supposed to stick to my terminology. So the San Agrelo type agriculture was collectivized in this Kolkhoz type, where basically the Soviets could not easily force people into collectivization. You can imagine it's much more difficult when you are dealing with an existing farmer who has his own cows, has his own everything. He doesn't want to necessarily cooperate with the other guys. He definitely don't want to transfer his assets into collective ownership. So it was much more difficult for the Soviets to collectivize, and there were delays, and there were mutinies, and Siberia was employed for the stubborn guys to send them off and to make it happen. But in the end, they were successful, but what they weren't successful in changing is the pattern of land ownership, which stayed there, the skills of people, because they were there and people continued to use these skills to make a profit even under the Soviet regime, as I described earlier, by loading these trucks and sending them everywhere. So in this situation, the guys in the west of Georgia, they are the candidates for normal farming, maybe service co-ops, maybe proper companies, and everything good that we observe in Europe, let's say. In the East, however, I believe, and we know it already today, when we look at the pattern of land ownership in Kakheti versus other parts of Georgia, we know that land in Kakheti is already today much more consolidated than everywhere else. And we look at the average size of plots, Kakheti data is available, Kakheti is much more consolidated than everywhere else. So the natural conditions and the way land has been always managed in Kakheti versus other parts, it sort of, history comes back. So, and as I tried to say more than once already, history has a lot of power to determine what is going to happen in the future. So I'm not puzzled. And I think it's logical what we have observed in terms of, it's not good, but logical. And when we are thinking about reforms, we should also consider the past, because I think it still contains lots of information that should be taken into account when designing interventions, be it cooperatives, or be it loans or vouchers or whatnot. The past is a very powerful factor.